Welcome to my office, everyone. As I mentioned, for the next 3 lectures, we will be meeting on YouTube. And these 3 lectures that really take place in the Renaissance, mostly the 16th century, all fit together in a very interesting way. The argument that I'm going to make is that there are 3 factors which contribute to the unfolding or the breaking down of Galenic orthodoxy in medicine. And the first of those will be the topic today, which is about herbals in the Renaissance, the invention of botany, and basically talking about herbs and spices, and especially those that come from the New World, why those kind of confuse people's understanding of the whole humoral system. In the next lecture, we'll be talking about Vesalius and the birth of modern anatomy. And then lastly, we'll talk about Paracelsus and the invention of chemical pharmacy, which is a really, really fascinating story. But today we'll talk about botany. Let me stop the music so you can focus. So I've mentioned through the course thus far that most of the pharmaceutical products in Europe through the Middle Ages were herb-based, right? They're either simples, things that are just one individual herb. That can be things that we sometimes think of as culinary today, tarragon or oregano or something like that, or spice, or they are these compounds, these very complicated galenics. If you think back to theriac or mithridatum, that can include 60 or 70 different exotic herbs. And remember also why some people seek out those really exotic herbs. They're markers of status, just as they are in cuisine. And there are a lot of them that are made from native grown plants as well. And not everyone can afford the really expensive things that come from the other side of the world. And usually they're very simple to prepare also. They may come in the form of a decoction, or as we would call a tea. It's not yet Camellia sinensis, but it's just something that's soaked in water, and for a water-soluble herb, that's perfectly fine. Or they may be ground and suspended in a solid medium, like as an unguent or a salve, sometimes mixed with fat that you'd put on a wound or something. They can be burned in the form of fumigation or a kind of incense, right? Myrrh has therapeutic properties, or even inhaled. Like think of the posies, right? In the Middle Ages, smelling those pomanders of herbs. It's a kind of aromatherapy, but designed to prevent you from breathing in all that miasmic swamp gas, basically. You could also take a therapeutic bath that would have herbs in it. You could also eat conserves or preserves. Things like marmalade starts out as a medicine, believe it or not. Quince or orange, or syrups. There's a whole fascinating book on syrups by Michael Servetus, who was burned for heresy also. But apart from that, he wrote a book on that. And then there's a whole slew of new things that are technically a tincture. And what that means is that they are suspended in alcohol as something like a cordial, which is good for your heart, core, or something like an aperitif that should open the passages of your body before digestion happens. We still have aperitifs, right? And those are often herbal infused things like vermouth, which is based on wormwood, or wormwood decoctions like absinthe, things that are sometimes distilled with the actual alcohol, or sometimes just thrown into the alcohol, and then the active properties come out into it. And a lot of those still exist, right? I mean, if you think of Benedictine or Chartreuse, those are examples of supposedly monastic originating drinks that are originally medicinal, but somehow people really like them and they started drinking them for fun, right? Because they're pleasant. There's also a whole slew of gums and resins and oils and things. So there's lots of different forms that plant-based medicines can come in. And obviously all of them, or many of them, have culinary uses too, right? Things that are like cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, cassia, spikenard. These are things you'll see in medical formulas, but you'll also see them in late medieval cooking too. So recall also another factor is that monasteries were frequently the places that kept the knowledge of these herbs, how to grow them, obviously, but also frequently people like cunning women, folk healers, people who would have need of inexpensive cures for everyday ailments that were not life-threatening, perhaps, but things that you could go to a local wise woman and say, I need, I have a cough. Give me something that'll open my chest. That's obviously I need right now, apparently. So there are herbs used at various different levels, right? They're at the academic, official level of people, inventing these medicines, and obviously in a university context. And those people are primarily still using the humoral system, right? They're thinking in terms of hot and cold and dry and all that. Um, but what has been added to this, as it has in other parts of medical practice, is the astrological. So sometimes someone will say, oh, this herb is good for this ailment caused by this astrological alignment, or sometimes like the best time to pick a particular herb will be when Saturn is ascendant or something to that. So weirdly, your horoscope actually has some impact on the kinds of herbs that you will use. And then there's also herbs that work through magical or sympathetic powers. But the point that I want to make now is that all these different kinds of meanings of how herbs work are held by all sorts of different practitioners. So it's not like the magic is just the folk healers and the university people are just the humoral medicine. And not at all. In fact, every kind of practitioner will at this point be using a combination of humors, astrology, sympathetic magic, sometimes the doctrine of signatures. Remember the walnuts are good for your brains, things like that. So every level will use everything. It's not like the magic is unprofessional. It's exactly professional. But in a sense, all the medicine is still humorally based. It's still allopathic. You're still talking about curing with opposites. Okay. But two things happen in this period that immediately precede the Renaissance. Renaissance, of course, we talked about in the last lecture, what that means culturally. One is the extended contact with Galen and these so-called galenicals, which are very, very complex, exotic compounds that are rare, expensive. Some of them were known by ancient Romans, but not all of them. Okay. That's one thing, is that they know what Galen was using now and how to get those things. Number two is that these are again considered desirable exotic drugs, and they are increasingly available, right? Through the East, that trade has opened up again, and people are getting them through the Mediterranean from the Venetians. Remember, the Venetian trade basically picks up things in Alexandria or Beirut, somewhere in the other side of the Mediterranean, or Constantinople, and those are carried either through the Red Sea or through the Persian Gulf, and then they come ultimately, of course, from India or Indonesia or someplace very far. And those spices that are sold in the Mediterranean, remember, they've gone through the hands of those middlemen who are usually Muslims, bought by the Venetians, and then they're the ones who resell it through the rest of Europe in direct competition with these local herbs, right? If you can't afford the expensive exotics, you use something local and cheap, right? So these are spices, and I should say there isn't really a botanical distinction between herbs and spices. They're all plant material, but in general, what it comes to mean culturally is that spices are dried. They come in dry form, very rarely used fresh, and they're usually parts of the plants, like the bark in the case of cinnamon, or the buds in the case of cassia buds are used also, or cloves or buds, or the roots as in the case of ginger, or the seeds, or and they're almost always things that come from very far away and are expensive. Not all the time. Coriander seed is a spice, and you can grow it in Europe, so it's not expensive or anything. But usually that distinction is between herbs and spices is that herbs are fresh and they're grown. You eat the leaves for the most part, or sometimes roots. Leek isn't an herb, but you understand what I'm saying. And sometimes the exact same plant, coriander will be the spice, and cilantro will be the herb eaten fresh. But let's get back to the spices. By the time they reach Europe, they are obscenely expensive. So only the wealthiest of people can be consumers, and they are symbols of social status, right? If you can afford to consume your wealth literally, whether it's for cooking or for medicine, um, that is, and of course, there's no sharp distinction between those two things, right? Food acts as medicine, and medicine is, corrects you, changes you, but they're still considered foods. They're in any case, the spices are symbols of status, and the only real difference is that medicines come in much more powerful dosages, right? So they're for pathological states that are extreme and that need an extreme imbalance. So you would mix something, if you had a really cold imbalance, you'd mix something that was really, really hot, had pepper, maybe ginger, maybe cloves in there that would burn on your mouth when you ate it, right? In cuisine, they're used in lesser doses and they're not as intense, and they're used to counterbalance potentially harmful foods, so that if you have a watery, cold, and moist cucumber, let's say, you'll correct that with a condiment that's hot and dry, like pepper, but not a whole lot of it, not in a pill form. You'd sprinkle it on the food, and that will be a corrective. So think back to the Cartesian coordinate plane that I showed you of balancing humors. But there are people who argue that by the time we get to the Renaissance and late Middle Ages, that there's sometimes a very humoral logic to the cooking too. I'm not entirely in agreement with that, but certainly there are things that look like it, right? That seem to be balancing, and dietitians say this all the time, that that's what you should do. Now, given the connection that certain plant drugs are used mostly because of their expense in a recipe. Some things, of course, don't taste very good, so they're not going to make it into cuisine. Wormwood you would never eat because it's really, really bitter and nasty. Rhubarb on its own, nowadays we add it to strawberries and make pies out of it. And rhubarb, I think, is actually nice, but there's a lot of things that just are so extreme in flavor that you'll see them go into medicine, but very rarely into food, just as they are. Um, and there are things that are originally quite rare. What happens is they're used more and more, and people, I won't say abuse them, but certainly they use them more frequently. And then when the demand spikes, someone says, "Oh, we need to import a lot more of this stuff," and then they start to be used only for cuisine. So there's a weird transition that a lot of drugs go through, where they'll start off being just medicine, and then they'll make this strange transition to being used recreationally. And of course, you can say that about many drugs too, right? Is exactly the trajectory they take. Alcohol also exactly the same. So let me give you two examples. Cloves is a very interesting example. That's something that was unknown to the ancients, actually. The Byzantines knew it, but Galen didn't. Um, it suddenly appears after the Crusades, and it becomes very popular in medicine. And if you put a clove in your mouth sometime, and you'll see it will numb your body. I mean, that's why they use it for toothaches and things. But in any case, more and more people say, the taste of cloves is really kind of pleasant and appealing, right? It's for the same reason we love pumpkin spice today, right? Cloves is one major element in there. Um, and more people want to cook with it, and then it comes in a greater volume, and then it goes out of fashion, really, as a drug, right? I mean, it's still, you'll see 4 grams caryophyllum, which means of cloves, but it's becomes primarily a culinary spice. And there are so many different herbs and spices that follow this trajectory. I think ginger, to some extent, follows a similar fate. Goes from being relatively rare food item into being just commonly used. They actually had it dry. In fact, they would have a hand of ginger. Have the whole root kind of look sometimes like a hand. Well, they get that whole piece dry and grate it, or pound it up into a powder and use it. But again, this is all pre-Renaissance. Okay, that's where we are right now. And on the brink of the Renaissance, there are still also a lot of native herbs that are used in both cuisine and medicine. So there's, things that are, how should I say, things that offer a kind of competition for the wealthier ones, the exotic things. There's usually some equivalent of a native herbs that are used in medicine or in cuisine or in textiles or as dye stuffs or in soap manufacture. I mean, there's things that are around that we'll see people argue, like, why are you going out of your way to get this ridiculously expensive spice when we've got native herbs here that that serve the same function. Um, and what is interesting, let me go into just a few of these spices because you will be, I mean, you're familiar with some of them, definitely, but and some probably not so much. Um, Let me start with pepper because pepper is very interesting. We are generally familiar with just one species of pepper in the West today. Black pepper, white pepper is just that with the outer covering taken off and dried, and green pepper, which is the same plant that is just immature, and then put it dried or put into like a brine or something. But they're all the same plant. They are a pipper long, a pipper. I forgot what it is, pipper something or another. But there were in the past. Oh, and pink I should mention is not pink peppercorns are not pepper at all. That's Schizinus mola. But there are. What is strange is that the sort of a byproduct of the global world supply of peppers, the one that we're only familiar with really is that one species. But in the past, they had long pepper, which is a long sort of catkin that is related to pepper, but that's the Piper longum, which is a little spicier, I think, than black pepper. Really interesting. They also had cubebs, which have a little sort of tail on the end. Pimiento del rabo is what they call them. It just means tailed pepper in Spanish. And that's medicine and cuisine, I should say. They also have melagueta pepper, which is they call grains of paradise. They used it in cooking and also in medicine. That is comes from the West African coast, and it disappeared almost entirely out of the culinary repertoire from the Renaissance all the way up through right about now. You can actually buy. I bought a jar of cubebs on Amazon of grains of paradise on Amazon. Very easy to find. A decade ago, you had to go to a special spice supplier. It was really hard to find. You also notice they put it in some types of gin. I think one of the Bombay Sapphire. One of the gin companies uses cubebs and grains of paradise in there, but it's not like a common thing you'd find on a table now. Other things that are imported, they imported not just ginger but galangal also. So if you're familiar with any Southeast Asian cuisine, you'll know galangal kind of looks like ginger. It's a little tougher, and usually you'll find a slice of it in a soup or something. But you can also grind it, dry it and grind it. You'll also find nutmeg, which is comes from what's now Indonesia. Is the nut from I'm forgetting all my botanical Latin today. Myristicum, something myristicum, but also the dried aril that surrounds that nutmeg, which is mace. And you can still buy that. It's not very common. Cinnamon, the form that comes from Sri Lanka, but also cassia, which comes from Southeast Asia. We've mentioned these before. Cardamom in various forms. There's green cardamom. There's brown. There's cloves. There's cassia buds that look like cloves, but they're actually the cassia plant. And in fact, when you buy cinnamon in the supermarket, you're actually buying cassia. It's not cinnamon. Sumac, which has almost completely disappeared in the West. It's a sour little berry from a tree that looks like a sort of staghorn, and these are really intensely sour and delicious in cuisine. And then I guess to these, handful, one medicine we have to add is sugar. That's how it starts. The ancients didn't have sugar. They sort of heard about it. Pliny mentions that he'd seen it, but it's really a very much medieval import. Very important, very expensive still. They try to grow it in Sicily and in southern Europe. It doesn't quite produce a good crop there. So we'll see. That's central to the story, is where you can grow these things. Oh, that's another very important thing about spices. They're tropical, right? You can't grow pepper in Europe, right? So this stuff is valuable as gold, more or less. And I should mention also, incidentally, that what spurs the whole era of exploration is spices, right? It's these medicines, foods, whatever you want to say, and other goods too, porcelain and silk and other luxury items. But really, that's why they're trying to get to Asia, because this is where this stuff grows. They don't know exactly where. They think it's China. It's not, obviously, but they're trying to get there. And pick up spices and bring them back. They're not trying to conquer anyone. These are traders, right? I mean, Columbus was a merchant. He was not not intending to found a whole new colony at all. Um, so the major changes in this whole story and what triggers everything really has to do with I shouldn't even call it exploration. They're just trying to find a better route to get to China. And so, if you are familiar with what was, probably taught to you as the so-called discovery of America, well, of course, there were people there already. It's not a discovery at all. But I think let's start not with Columbus at all, but let's start with the Portuguese, because they're, in a way, they're almost more important. They're the real trigger, and they're the real navigators. So let's start with this map here. I want you to look at it. I hope it's not backwards. It probably is. Now that I'm thinking about this and I'm showing it to you, I'm not sure how it's going to show up. But in any case, look at a map if you don't have one. And I want you to think about the situation of Portugal geographically, the way it juts out into the Atlantic Ocean, and the attempt of the Portuguese to find a direct route all the way around Africa. Eventually they figure out they can do that across the Indian Ocean to India, to Indonesia, to China, to Japan, and cutting out those Islamic middlemen and cutting out the Venetians too, of course. This is a matter of profit, okay? But the efforts start in the 15th century by the king of Portugal at the time, Enrique, and Henry the Navigator, even though he never went to sea. The Portuguese started to move down the west coast of Africa. They had new navigation techniques using the Arab invented astrolabe and sextants, using Portoland charts that had rum lines. You've probably seen these things. They had sturdier ships that could go out into the ocean, not the Mediterranean galley, that's rowed with slaves and stuff. These are big. First, a ship called the Nau, okay, which is a big ocean-going vessel, and eventually galleons that can go out into the open sea. In general, though, they stuck close to the coastline, right? Because in order to navigate, you basically want to look where the North Star is. You want to figure out where the coastline marker is, and then you create a triangle. That's not a triangle, that's a triangle. And then you can figure out mathematically where you are in terms of your latitude, where you are north and south on the globe, okay? They can't do longitude yet. They can't figure out where the sorry, they can figure they can figure out a line and then go across, but they can't figure out longitude. Am I getting this wrong? Yeah, right. Longitude, because no, they can't figure out. Shit, it's one of these two. Without a clock, you can't figure out the longitude. You can figure out the latitude, where you are going this way across around the Earth, okay? But you can't figure out where you are up and down, I guess. In any case, let's get to the points. They start going down the coast of Africa to pick up ivory, slaves, gold, and eventually Bartholomew Diaz rounds the Cape of Good Hope in 1480s. Okay, they get around the bottom of the tip of Africa, and they figure, oh, we can go all the way to India. Take a look at this map again. I guess it's here's the tip of Africa. You go this way, you get to India, to Indonesia. I mean, it's a long journey, but Vasco da Gama reaches India in the 1490s. Now, the immediate effect of all this, without going into the details, is that this is direct contact, trading contact with Asia, where the spices come from, and they start to come back in much greater volume, right? And naturally, of course, the price drops. Okay? Now, the effect that this has on Europe, in the long term, the price drops. In the short term, it doesn't actually. The Portuguese are not stupid; they're going to keep the price high. But but immediately, eventually, more people start using spices. There's more volume. They start using it in cooking. It shows up in cookbooks. More pharmaceutical texts use these. And what happens is, who is going to be interested in this anymore when everyone can have it? It's not a marker of status anymore, right? Right? The wealthy kind of it's not a big deal if everyone's driving around in a Cadillac. You need a better car. You need your Lamborghini or whatever it is. It's going to show off your status. So keep in mind, like those rising bourgeois class people who can now imitate their superiors, they are going to eat more, use more spices, medicine and cooking, and that's why it loses its status. And I think that's why these go from being very um, important medicines to being almost completely culinary. Um, and I think now people also say, okay, we need other medicines, right? If these are not cool anymore or they're not as effective as we thought they were, um, we should find new things. And in fact, that's exactly what happens to sugar, right? At this point, also, remember, sugar was a kind of wonder drug among the Arab authors, and then it gets to Europe, and it was increasingly used as a flavoring. But what makes it really cheap is when it starts to be grown in the New World. We'll get there in a moment, okay? And then, eventually the masses are eating candy, right? But it was a very, very expensive elite thing to start with. Someone eventually got the bright idea to try and grow the stuff in Europe. It's not quite hot enough for a good crop, so they try Madeira, they try the Canary Islands, which are off the coast of Africa, and the real problem they encounter is that it takes a lot of labor to process the plants, to crush the canes, to extract the juice, to cook it down in the kettle to make sugar out of it, dry sugar, and so they don't really have workers. Like, it's hard getting people to work in the 1480s and 90s, and that's the point where it dawns on them: slaves. We can just buy these people, trade for horses for humans or whatever it may be, and slave labor, is replenishable. It's cheap. We can use them on these islands, and eventually we'll see they start using them in the Caribbean and in Brazil. And I mention it here because the coast of Africa, the Canaries and Madeira and places like that, are kind of the model for what will happen in the Caribbean for that whole economy. It'll be plantations. It'll be African labor enslaved to grow sugar for things that were once sugar was once a medicine, an exclusive luxury medicine, and increasingly it becomes an item of popular consumption. Everyone starts using it because it comes in great volume and it becomes relatively cheap. Um, and so when Columbus bumps into America, thinking he's in Asia, and of course he thinks it's Asia till his dying day. He's never corrected of that. But the more interesting consequence of Columbus's discovery is that, of course, he found a lot of foodstuffs, right? I mean, he found all those things we talked about in the Aztec Empire: the corn, the chili peppers, the tomatoes. Later on, potatoes come from the Andes. But in the long run, those certainly change European eating habits in the long run. And I'll come back to that when we talk about biology later on. But for the moment, imagine all of these bizarre new plants coming into Europe. How does that change people's attitude toward these botanical authorities like Galen and Dioscorides and Avicenna, the Greeks and the Arabs, who were writing about plants in Europe and Northern Africa and Asia? They were kind of incomplete to start with, remember? And their advice basically, limited geographically. What about these New World plants? Not a clue. They're not mentioned anywhere. And I think so what happens is the first kind of field in medicine that really looks and says, these authorities just don't work anymore. Galen is not a good resource, he's not a good authority, because he doesn't know about half the plants in the world now. So really botany, or let's say botanical pharmacy, begins to realize that these authorities were hopelessly misinformed about all the American plants. And the other very interesting thing is, remember when this coincides exactly with the point where printing comes into play. So, and illustrations, remember the herbals that are printed are increasingly illustrated, and those, at the same time, the anatomy is also. It's the exact same time also that botany becomes a major branch of medicine in the universities. Is Padua has its own botanical garden right here, um, and soon every major university gets a botanical garden. Bologna, Leiden, Oxford's is, I think, maybe the next is maybe the 17th century, but Paris gets one. But it's at the point that this whole flurry of New World plants and drugs starts to come in, some of which they can grow in Europe, some of which they can't. Guaiac they can't. We'll come to that in a moment. But this whole new botany is, it's still firmly humoral, right? They're still understanding plants in humoral terms, but they're trying to make sense of these new plants in the existing theoretical framework, right? And the system itself doesn't get abandoned for quite a while. It's just that the texts that they're using are just not very useful anymore. And so the Europeans start writing their own, much more extensive, much more valuable, and illustrated and printed. So they're spread all over the place and everyone's looking at them. So let me mention first a couple of the new drugs that are imported and how they're used. So the first one, very interestingly, you can still find this if you go into like especially a Mexican botanical shop will carry sarsaparilla, which is first enters Europe in 1545, becomes a competitor with guaiac. Remember, that's a cure for syphilis. And it first description appears in the works of several important physicians. Cardano is one of them. Amatus Lusitanius prescribes it for rheumatism. But the individual who really popularizes this is the guy I mentioned a few lectures back, which is Nicolas Monardes, right? He's a Spaniard practicing in the city of Seville, which is where all the ships had to go through to come from the New World. They had to go through Seville. And he published this extensive work on New World drugs in 1569. It appears in like 50 editions, several different languages, and it appears in English, translated by Frampton. What's his name? John Frampton, not Peter Frampton. No, it's John. It's called Joyful News Out of the Newfound World. And Monardes actually never went to the New World, I should mention. He just got these plants sent to him. And my point is, this is all advertising. It's great ads for these New World drugs. And Monardes said sarsaparilla, or sarsaparilla as we say it in the West, is a hot and dry in the second degree. It is a blood purifier, and it's a diaphoretic, which means it makes you pee. Okay. Interestingly, it retains its popularity. It when they start bringing it in, it's not really. I mean, it's to start, it's expensive. After a while, it becomes more common and cheap. Peddlers start making sarsaparilla decoctions, and it's weirdly, it stays in patent medicines up into the 19th century. But why do professional physicians increasingly ignore it? A, doesn't actually do a whole lot. I mean, but B, wealthy clients want something rarer and more exotic, and who needs it? And I would say C, is it actually tastes good. This is something that is pleasant, and if you need an excuse to take medicine, you might put it in a kind of syrup, make a drink out of it, and say, well, this is really good for me. I'm going to take this all the time. The exact same fate befalls the next wonder drug, which is sassafras. Comes first from Florida, actually. Said to comfort the liver and stomach, engenders good humors. According to Monardes, the English herbalist Girard says it's hot and dry, opens obstructions in the body, recommended for gout, dropsy, jaundice, syphilis, scurvy. And there were actually English merchants in the early 17th century who went on expeditions hoping to bring back sassafras and be able to charge 50 pounds a ton for this. And 50 pounds is like $50 million today, okay? Now again, what has happened to both of these things? Where is sassafras now? There's two places you might find it. One is it's ground up into make filet powder to make gumbo in Louisiana, but that's not what I'm thinking of. Is the roots will be familiar to you as root beer. Is it becomes something taken for recreationally, for pleasure, because it tastes really nice. Nowadays it's always artificially flavored, unfortunately, but the because someone suggested that it was carcinogenic at one point, but real root beer is made from the roots of sassafras plant, which you'll recognize. It has a little glove shape. It's like, it looks either like a mitten or like this, or sometimes it, 2 or 3 different lobes on it, but you never mistake it for anything else. It grows all over the west, on the East Coast. So I used to, as a kid, pull up sassafras roots and make tea all the time. But now it has no role in medicine. It's just a pleasant drink, root beer, right? The third New World drug, and I think one of the most fascinating in the history of all of them, is a flowering shrub in the Solanaceae family. And remember, Europeans knew some of the Solanaceae. As these little tubular flowers, they knew deadly nightshade. Remember that drug that belladonna, which makes your pupils dilated and supposedly makes you look more beautiful, but it will also kill you. It's poison. It's a narcotic poison. But it's relative of peppers and tomatoes. Weirdly, they separated, millions of years ago. But this is another one, another Solanaceae, that the explorers, I should say the conquerors, when saw Native Americans using this herb, they applied it to cuts and bruises. They used it as a poultice. They drunk it in a decoction. And then the weirdest thing of all to Europeans is they put this stuff in big tubes. They packed it in the back of a tube, lit it on fire, and took an enormous toke of this and blew it out. And of course, I'm talking about tobacco. Europeans didn't even have a word for to smoke. They didn't never inhaled any smoke directly. It was just a completely foreign concept to them. In fact, the English, you say they drank the fumes into their lungs because they didn't have a verb to smoke. They didn't drink it. They smoked, definitely smoked it. It is obviously mildly narcotic. It's a stimulant. We know now, a carcinogen. The Latin botanical name, Nicotiana Tobacco, Nick was another one of its early promoters who got some seeds around 1560, planted them in his garden near Paris, and subsequently used by him to cure skin ailments and cuts. And he's the one, I think, who told Menards about it. But in any case, it's a wonder drug when it first arises, and you can imagine why an herb that dries and heats and can expel phlegm from your lungs and would be great for counteracting any phlegmatic humor. It's used in colds and coughs and things like that. I know that makes no sense to us now. It sounds horrible, but it caught on in Europe for social reasons and for medical reasons, and people used to actually smoke it in these little silver pipes, and they'd be like, good shit, man, and they'd pass around the tobacco to people. But it enters a serious way in the pharmacopoeia in the 1570s for lung ailments, and immediately the European craze for smoking catches on. It's all by pipe. Remember, they don't have tobacco rolled in paper. That's a Crimean War, 19th century. And then all of a sudden, the physicians say, wait a minute, is it really hot and drying? This whole battle emerges between the pro-smokers and the anti-smokers. Some say it causes inebriation. It will dry up the radical moisture, meaning it's really way, way too dry. It will prevent mental acuity because the moist brain, will dry out because of it. It will lower your sperm count. Remember that connection? Brain down through the spinal column directly into your... So there are people who are saying this is really a dangerous drug. In fact, James I of England wrote a diatribe, the counter blast to tobacco, because he personally hated the habit and he thought it was, something that only savages would do. But his courtiers, like Walter Raleigh, were smoking at court, and he thought it horrible. So my point is, what just happened because of this confusion over the new drug? People start arguing and debating and rethinking and saying, wait a minute, maybe the original framework of our logic is faulty. Maybe, maybe it's not a hot and drying drug, because if it's narcotic, that should suggest that it's slowing you down, that ultimately you get sleepier, and if it makes you dizzy, then it's probably cold, right? So there's this argument over what the exact properties of it are. It is a luxury item, and as you probably know, plantation economy takes care of this, especially in Virginia, right? Virginia's once John Rolfe figures out the species to grow there, that becomes the cornerstone of the whole Virginia colony in what's now Virginia, right? North Carolina, that area. Um, Becomes a big commodity in the world economy. And interestingly, I should mention this. It's like sugar and like some of these spices, it's totally superfluous. It has no nutritional value. It's unnecessary, and yet that's what causes the plantation economies and the slavery and the all of world history is changed because of a few stupid plants. That's what it comes down to, right? And as we know, we're still using tobacco. And as I need to say, need I say, precisely the same is true of another thing that comes in first as medicine, believe it or not, is cacao. And if you remember, I mentioned the Aztecs used it as money. And when it reaches Europe, people first say this: the most healthful and nutritious aliment known to all the world. For one who takes a cup of it, even though he may have a long journey, can pass the whole day without taking another thing, and being cold of its nature, it's best in hot weather. They said cold because if chocolate on its own is bitter and sour, um, and not sweetened yet. It's before you sweeten it or add aromatics and things. So the point, at that point, I should mention, chocolate is always drunk, right? Cacao is ground up, put in a liquid, and you drink it. You don't. There's no solid eating chocolate yet. And what I want to say is that for the few of these drugs, foods, did they understand how to classify in the humoral system? Ultimately, I think what it did is weaken the whole comprehensiveness and validity of the system, and because physicians keep arguing about it. No, it's hot and dry because it's nutritious. It must be hot and moist. Someone else said no, it's sour. It's got to be cold. It's got to be. And by the later 16th century, every book of remedies, every herbal, every dietary has its own opinion. What do you have? Chaos, absolute nutritional chaos, kind of like what we experience today when something new comes in. We change our mind about it, right? Coconut used to be the saturated fat. You can't get coconut out of all of our food, and now it's a health food. It's a superfood. I mean, it's like change your mind really, really quickly. But in any case, that in the 16th century, I think really discredited the system. And it, on the one hand, it turned a lot of physicians away from dependence on these exotic imports and made them turn to native medicines. This is a really interesting book in English by Timothy Bright called The Sufficiency of English Medicines. That's just one very good example. But you find that kind of opinion across the board as people saying, oh, why are we bringing in this expensive import when we have very comparable things here or things that are even better? And their argument is very persuasive in some respects, is that A, it's affordable, so it's not just for the rich or elites. Anyone can grow these things that are native. And the logic of what they're saying also is that by providence and maybe even purely environmental factors, the foods and medicines that grow in a particular area are best suited for people who actually live there. Now, obviously, there's no idea of sort of evolution yet, but the idea is that over centuries of cohabitation, the animals and the people who use them kind of grow together and are used to each other, and their bodies will know how to deal with them. And strange exotic things, obviously, your body's never encountered these. They're going to be difficult to assimilate or to use even as a medicine. So throughout the 16th century, there are people who are arguing that we should use our own foods and medicines, and that our bodies are adapted to through long custom, and not use these weird, strange imports, exotic imports. So, and of course, you can also turn this whole argument on its head, is that people have been using these things so long that they're really not strong anymore, and that's why we need concentrated, much more powerful herbs, and that will be one of the arguments, in fact, that Paracelsus uses for chemical medicines. We'll get to that a couple of lectures down. And the argument also says that, people once had very simple, frugal lives, and gentle herbs were all the medicine that anyone needed. But now that we have luxury and rush and riot and excess, we have much more serious diseases. Look at things like syphilis and whatever. And we need stronger medicines and sometimes more powerful exotics. So we'll see both of those arguments. So for the moment, let's talk about botanical pharmacy in the 16th century, what the herbals that were printed, what kinds of products they recommended, and how these things worked. Um, there were botanical works printed in the first decades of technology, the so-called earliest books printed. They're called incunabula, which means in the cradle, books before the 16th century. And most of these tended to think about plants in terms of Aristotelian natural philosophy. They're talking about generation, growth, why the structures are suited to do what they're supposed to do, the teleology, remember that word? Or they're purely practical. They'll tell you this herb is good for this sickness, or they're purely dietary. This plant's good for this imbalance, humoral imbalance, or they're agricultural. This herb planted when, in this kind of soil quality, whatever. Or they're household oriented. And you can imagine most of this information is actually dominated by Dioscorides, people like him who are, and commentators, Arab commentators, of course. And the Materia Medica, among the very first books printed in this genre, really make use of Dioscorides, a little bit of Theophrastus, if you remember him, to some extent Pliny. They're very crudely illustrated. The opinions are entirely derivative, and they're interesting, but they're not. They're nothing. Well, let me show you just sort of what some of these look like. This is from the Herba Artemisia. So that's wormwood. Herba Artemisia. What does it say? Philos Matricale. It's from the Herbarium Apulae Platonici, 1480s. Okay, obviously you're not going to get much botanical information out of anything like that, something like that. And they are, in fact, there's one that I like rather a lot. I remember I was in the Bodleian Library in Oxford and came across the I'm forgetting the name. The Orta Sanitatis means the Garden of Health, 1491, and it has all of these wonderful illustrations of. I know this is from it. There you go. The Narcissus. You remember the myth of the Narcissus? Was a plant. The guy was looking at himself and fell in love with himself, a narcissist, right? And he was transformed into a flower, and so that's the flower that has the little guy in it. But clearly, that's just, silly, if nothing else. And that's the extent of a botanical illustration, right? They're not meant to actually look like the plants and give you an idea of exactly what it is. The Orta Sanitatis also has like monsters and chameleons and camelopards and a half man, half dog creature in there, and the rabbit fish and stuff. They're hilarious. So when does this change? Well, it changes exactly the same time as the Galenic revival, I should mention. Exactly the same time printing becomes really inexpensive, early 16th century, about the 1530s. There is a kind of botanical renaissance. And I want to show you sort of what happens in these. This is Otto von Brunfels. This is Hellebore niger, which is black hellebore. You can see they're drawn a lot more precisely, so you can actually tell what it looks like when it's grown with the roots and the leaves and the flowers. And Otto Brunfels, he's really one of the first in this. It's not this genre as it's printed. He gives you an extensive description. He'll tell you how it grows, the various uses, but what most importantly is it's illustrated. You can actually see what these plants look like and see the morphology of them. And it is a kind of direct, accurate observation that I'm going to argue is key to this whole period. Why medicine changes is largely because of the illustrations, the accurate woodcuts or copper plate engravings, and then the fact that it's printed and they're spread all over the place so everyone can really see these. And they are beautiful, right? No doubt about that. So this is from, so Brunfels' work, I should say. This is called Herbarum Vivae Icones, Pictures of Living Herbs, I guess is what it is, 1530. Meant to be used by practicing physicians. You'd have this as a reference work and you'd go and use it. Even though its content is not very revolutionary, I think the format really is. And the woodcuts, that's by Hans Weiditz. Those are really beautiful. The second figure in this whole Renaissance is Hieronymus Bock, B-O-C-K, or sometimes you'll see his name Tragus. That's just a translation of the word, his name in Latin. Wrote this thing called the Neue Kräuterbuch, the new Kraut is the word kraut, like sauerkraut, is just means vegetables. So the new herb book that's 1539 in Strasbourg. Strasbourg is in France now. It was German then. And his strength was vivid descriptions of the plants. It's in German, notice, not Latin. And unlike Brunfels, I think he saw all of these plants himself. He knew exactly what they look like and didn't depend so much on the classical authorities. And he is how should I say? He's kind of a myth buster. Let's put it that way, okay? Like he'll repeat a story about some myth. And so, let me give you an example. There's a silly idea that ferns have no fruits or seeds. They reproduce at one night a year on Midsummer's Eve, and it's dangerous to see that this happen during special ceremonies. And he looks at these very closely and said, what do you mean they don't have fruits or seeds? Look at the underside of the leaves. They have these little spores. That's how they propagate. And then they have different forms, as they're growing, and then they sprout up and whatever. But he just proves that the myth is nonsense. Another person I want to show you is Leonard Fuchs, F-U-C-H-S. You might know the name from the fuchsia or fuchsia, right? Gives us that beautiful plant and the color, of course, fuchsia. He was a professor at Ingolstadt first and then Tübingen. He wrote 1542 the De Historia Stirpium, which is his masterpiece in Latin and also German editions. 400 native plants are included, 100 foreign species. And he's really like this incredible learned botanist who calls for a critical discussion of the classical authorities, says we need to change their terminology. They didn't really have enough words to describe plant growth and change. And he's, it's a beautiful book. It's also written in this beautiful Renaissance Latin, humanist Latin. The texts are all illustrated. There's a point where he's saying, the study of plants, we know it's good for medicine, but it's also really pleasurable. He says that, let me read you a little passage from this. He says, there is no one who does not know that there is nothing in life, this is direct translation from Latin, so triple, quadruple negatives, but know that in life there's nothing more pleasant and more delightful than to wander over woods, mountains, and plains, garlanded, adorned with flowerets, plants of various sorts, and to gaze intently upon them. And I say, thank you. He's absolutely right. Leonard Fuchs. There is another German, Valerius Cordus, I should mention. Not very well known as the other ones, but his own Historia Stirpium is published, and I think it's even more detailed than the other ones. A lot of direct examination, discussion of plants for their own sake. It's not just his medicine, incidentally. He wants to know. This is real botany. I'm trying to argue. While all of this is happening, there's also... I should show you more pictures, I guess, while I'm standing here. This is, the tobacco that's in Menards, actually. So I've mentioned him, right? And this is from Fuchs. This is Cucumis turcicus, he says. A variety of, I think it's a melon. It's kind of I don't know what kind of melon, but it's a beautiful illustration. This is let me wait before I get to Bauan and the others. So there's Low Countries also have flourishing botanical works. Antwerp especially, because there's a printer there named Plantin who is central, churning out all this medical, botanical, and scientific work. And I think the first most important Belgian botanist is Rembert Dodoens, D-O-E-N-S, who wrote a Cacao de Boek in Flemish in 1544. There's also a French version. And then, like the German one, this has got lots of full descriptions of the plants, beautiful illustrations. A lot is actually borrowed from Fuchs, but it's an interesting book. His contemporary, Jules Charles de Lecluse, or Clusius, is another important one of this time, who was... he knew a lot of very famous people. Like, he knew Sidney and Drake in England, and they sent him plants from the New World, from North America. He had students collecting plants all over the place, and is said to have identified over 600 new species. So his book, published in 1601, is Rariorum Plantarum Historia, History of Rare Plants. Easy enough. And he also wrote a Fungorum Historia, which is a history of mushrooms. He's sort of the father of mycology. This is Clusius I'm talking about. I think he's the first to write about potatoes also, the South American potato, not sweet potatoes. Founded the Botanical Garden in Leiden. So there's this like sort of burst of botanical activity everywhere. Another person who follows him is de Lobel, Matthias de Lobel, or Lobelius. Lobelia is a plant named after him. Really interesting. And who else have I gotten here? Maybe Gaspard Bauhin. If I seem to have misplaced a page here. No, here it is. Sorry. Bauhin is another Histoire universelle des plantes. That's a little later, 1619, published after his death. Got 5,000 plants in it. The one person I really love is actually a physician. Is Conrad Gesner. He's a Swiss in Zurich, real humanist, new Greek, unlike most of these guys, and was a professor of natural history and philosophy at Zurich. But like sort of an encyclopedic knowledge of plants, and wrote about everything scientifically. So if you ever want to just drop down in a book and see some exquisite language and texts, I think Conrad Gesner is really one of the most interesting of all these. Who else have I left out? Pier Andrea Mattioli. Mattiolus is Italian. Writes what looks like it's going to be a commentary on Dioscorides, but it actually ends up being a botanical bestseller. 32,000 copies of this sold. And knew lots of plants. Who else should I mention in this context? His Prospero Alpino is the first to write about coffee, the first description of coffee in Europe, at least. I mentioned Monard in Spain. So there's this kind of activity that's going on all over the place. And I guess rather than blab on about all these guys, let me show you some of their beautiful drawings. That's in Bauhin. I think it is Solanum tuberosum esculentum. There's our potato. You didn't know potatoes had fruits like that. We were just used to the little tubers underground, but that's a potato. Here is from Lobelius's Krautbuch, Nicotiana Tobacco, and there's that long tube I was talking about with the guy taking a big toke of that monster doobie. Right, but that's the tobacco plant. You can always tell by these little trumpet-shaped flowers. And then there is, who else do I want to show you some images? I guess I've shown you. Yes, I've shown you those. But let me show you also what the books themselves look like. So this is from Girard. I'm pretty sure this is Girard. It gives you a description of sugarcane. Can you see that? They'll give you, like, you know, how it grows, what its humoral properties are, a little illustration next to it, and then where it grows, what time. So this is just sort of standard. I'm showing this to you because John Girard is the famous English herbalist, the first of these. And his book is actually still in print. You can buy a copy in Barnes & Noble, as far as I know. There's the paper read. Here is, come on, guys, look. Is that not lovely? Turkey corn, right? It's in fact the reason we call it corn. That's not what it's called. It's maize. Everywhere else in the world, corn just means grain. Is because we have this beautiful illustration and description that says these were first brought into Spain and then other provinces of Europe, not out of Asia Minor, which is the Turks' dominion, but out of America and the islands adjoining as Florida, Virginia, Norumbega, that's New England, where they used to sow or set to make bread out of it. It grows much higher in other countries than in other countries. It's planted in the gardens. In summer it falleth out to be fair and hot, and myself have seen proof in my own garden. He got seeds and grew it. Growing corn in Elizabethan England, folks. Sown in March and April. Turkey, it's called Frumentum turcicum, maxicum, or maize. Maize, he says, and that's of course the botanical term today. Probability was unknown to ancient Greek and Latin authors. Of course, he's absolutely right about that. Not just probability, it's positively true. So it is a really fun book, and just to give you an idea of what it looks like, there's our apples of love, the pomes d'amores. which I think is indeed a tomato. Okay, pomodoro, right? That means golden apple, but it's Pomace amoris is another word for it. Um, Thorn apples. There's his description of tobacco. Is he on the side or two kinds, one greater, one lesser? He describes the plant itself. He talks about the kind that come from Trinidado. I swear that this tobacco is the finest Trinidado. It is very, very good. So anyway, it's a madrigal about tobacco, believe it or not, around the time of Shakespeare. The names, the properties. Here it comes to the virtues. Menard says that it's a remedy for pain in the head or a migraine. Um, Remedy for fits of the mother, mitigate the pain of the gout. Roasted in the hot embers, applied to the grieved part. It's good for toothache, teeth and gums, rubbed with linen cloths, dipped in the juice. A weight of 4-ounce juice, drunk procureth long and sound sleep. Tobacco, like think of drinking like that sounds horrible, but anyway. But moreover, the same man reported he'd been cured many countrymen of agues, distilled water of the leaves drunk in a while. And then he said there's an oil to be taken out of, but the dried leaves are taken in a pipe and set on fire and sucked into the stomach. No, but it's in the lungs, but okay. And then thrust forth again at the nostrils against pain in the head, rheums, which is runny nose, aches in any part of the body, wheresoever the original proceed, whether France, Italy, Spain, or Indies, from our familiar is the best and best known diseases. The leaves palliate ease for a time, but never perform any cure absolutely, for they empty the body of humors that cause a grief that cannot be taken away. So he's actually on the side of saying it's really not good. If you can use it once in a while, especially for pains in the head, stomach, grief in the breast and lungs, against catarrh and rheum, cold and hoarseness, but it is not good for as many things as people think it is. So there's your being skeptical about the sources, worrying. There's our Jerusalem artichokes. Here is Potatoes of Virginia. It's a lovely, lovely book. So, in sum, I just want to say that, as I will argue in the next couple of weeks, the discovery of modern botany, if you will, coincides with the discovery of modern anatomy and the discovery or invention of modern chemical pharmacy. And these three things so challenge the Galenic orthodoxy. The moment after it's revived, really, in its original form, it starts to be disassembled and pulled apart. And as we'll see later, other discoveries and inventions really make it unbelievable anymore. And then other systems come in to not replace it entirely, but to exist side by side. The chemical and then the mechanical theories of physiology become rivals. And think about the theme in the course, right? You have lots of people arguing what happens. Innovation, invention, new discoveries. And I think botany is the first of these things. Okay, so next time we'll come back and we'll talk about Vesalius, which is great stuff.